Hey, everybody. How are you? And welcome to another episode of the John Riley Project. This is a podcast all about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We welcome your thoughts and comments as we talk about a lot of, let's just say, news issues, political issues, cultural issues, societal issues. I like to keep my focus here locally on San Diego County, my hometown of Poway. But today we're going to talk about things outside of our community. So we'll talk a little bit about Trump. We're going to talk about the Libertarians. We're going to talk about a lot of political myths that are being spread out there that I wanted to address. And then I want to give you just a few highlights of a recent vacation we had in Ireland. So how you doing, everybody? Hope you're doing well. Hope the day is treating you well. It's June and summertime is getting started. So this is all good stuff. Here in my local hometown of Poway, I will say that there is still a little something bubbling here when it comes to this Lifetime Fitness facility in Poway. I guess they're bringing their plan forward to the Poway City Council. And of course, a lot of people have their hands up in the air. Oh my God, they're trying to put in this larger Lifetime Fitness facility in the farm in Poway. They're going to present an updated plan. Some people think that the plan that they're presenting is fraudulent and is just filled with lies. I think we're going to find out more as we get into it. But right now, not a lot going on locally. So I want to just share some thoughts more nationally on some broader things that are on my mind. So, this is a community forum. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in the live chat on Facebook, on Twitter, or on YouTube, and we'll get you involved. Okay. Let's talk a little bit. I know this says local news and comment, but we're going to talk a little bit about national issues. And I want to talk about Donald Trump and the Libertarians. And this was in the news a few weeks ago. You may have seen it, where Donald Trump actually made an appearance at the Libertarian Party National Convention and was greeted with boos and jeering and all kinds of things. And as a result, he was kind of ridiculed in the national media after this. And for most people, if they saw anything about this story, that's the part they saw, was that the Libertarian Party was booing and yelling at Trump at the convention. But really, there's a lot more to this story that I wanted to explain to you that I think is interesting. And it's particularly interesting to me. And perhaps I think this is going to be interesting to you. So first of all, if you follow me on my podcast, you know that I comment a lot on local politics, national politics. And I'm never really happy with the two alternatives that we're given in the ballot every year. Like right now, it's Trump and Biden. Last time it was Trump and Biden. The time before that, it was Hillary and Trump. I mean, we can go back in history, and we have been served up so many horrible candidates. And in this particular race, Trump and Biden are still both horrible candidates for very different reasons. And so I have always been interested to see how independent candidates and third-party candidates do, because I want some alternative to these two insane, foolish candidates that are being served up to us. And as a matter of fact, through the 90s and part of the 2000s, I was part of the Libertarian Party. It was just what I had signed up for in terms of my party preference. But for the longest time, the Libertarian Party has just been a failure, has been full of sort of, how should I say this? Contrarians that just don't want to follow certain norms in society. And as a result, they've been perceived as a joke in a lot of ways. And I can't blame people for thinking that. But there's been development in the Libertarian Party that I think is worthy of mentioning. So for the longest time, Libertarian Party would typically nominate candidates that were often a lighter version of a Republican and sometimes a lighter version of a leftist. But more often than not, the 2016 and the 2012 presidential nominee for the Libertarians was Gary Johnson, who was the governor of New Mexico, a longtime Republican that had switched parties. And there have been other cases of Republicans that got fed up with the GOP and switched to the Libertarian Party. In some cases, because the Libertarian Party was more representative of who they were, because they were only in the Republican Party, because they knew that that's where the power structure is, and running as a libertarian is pretty much a recipe for failure no matter what. But the Libertarian Party now has been trying to make changes, and I have been on the sidelines. I'm a registered independent for over 10 years, but I'm always sort of curious to see what the Libertarian Party is doing, because I'm kind of rooting for them. I mean, it seems like they have an opportunity, if they got their act together, to actually be impactful. Because I think, generally speaking, a lot of people in America believe in the whole idea of having, sort of being socially liberal, being able to live your life as you wish. And that means extending equal rights to LGBTQ and, and it also means having abortion to be open and freely choosable. On social issues, libertarians tend to be more liberal if you want to look at it through that lens. And on fiscal issues like taxation and government spending tend to be a lot more fiscally conservative. And that's sort of a very broad paintbrush of where libertarians typically line up. Now, my views are largely that, but not exactly that, and I have some nuances about how I kind of see the world, but I've always tried to keep an eye on the party. Now, the Libertarian Party now has made a big change. In 2020, there was a lot of rumblings within the party that they wanted to have a right-wing group within the Libertarian Party called the Mises Caucus to take over. And what they wanted to do was to essentially rebuild the Libertarian Party in the image of Ron Paul. You may remember Ron Paul was he was a Libertarian candidate for president, the party nominee in 1988. But he had been a longtime Republican congressman serving since the late 70s and into the 2010s before he finally retired. His son is Rand Paul, who's a senator from Kentucky. And when Ron Paul ran for president in 2008 and in 2012, he really lit the fire of a lot of people that were looking for an alternative. Someone that was against a lot of the foreign wars, against a lot of the intrusiveness and meddlesome efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, someone that wanted to end the Fed and bring back some sort of monetary policy that made sense. He was a guy that wanted to cut spending, balance the budget, lower taxes. For a lot of people, Ron Paul was a breath of fresh air. And granted, Ron Paul had a couple of goofy ideas too, but overall, he kind of caught my attention as well. And so the Libertarian Party has been trying to rebuild themselves into the image of Ron Paul. And in 2022, this Mises Caucus, which was a subgroup of the Libertarian Party, had taken control of party leadership at the national and at the statewide levels in most of the 50 states. And this was kind of now granted, the Libertarian Party gets about 3% of the vote, maybe 2% of the vote in a national race for president. So it's relatively insignificant. But there has been a revolution within that party to kind of shift the strategy, which I think on one level is a good thing because the previous strategy wasn't working. But on another level, what they were trying to accomplish really made no sense. And let's kind of get down to this whole thing about the Mises Caucus. So Angela McArdle, who is the president of the Libertarian Party, and a lot of the other leaders wanted to invite Donald Trump to speak at the Libertarian National Convention. Now, first of all, this is an amazing thing, because how often do you see leading politicians from competitive parties or the presumed nominee of a competitive party speaking at a different party's political convention? I mean, that would be like President Trump showing up at the Democratic convention and speaking, or Biden showing up at the Republican convention. But what the Libertarian Party did is they invited Trump, they invited RFK Jr., they invited Biden. And RFK Jr. and Trump said, yeah, we'll take your invitation. Now, they each had different strategies. RFK Jr., of course, is running as an independent, but he was flirting with the idea of running as a libertarian, not necessarily because he has libertarian views. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s views are very leftist in a lot of ways. But he was looking at the Libertarian Party as a means of gaining ballot access. because the Libertarian Party is already pre-qualified on, I don't know what it is, roughly 40 state ballots. And in many previous elections, the Libertarian Party is qualified on all 50 states. So it has been something that independents and other sort of alternative candidates have always looked upon the Libertarian Party as a prize to get that ballot access, because it's damn hard to qualify to get on ballots in all 50 states, unless you're a Republican or a Democrat who the system is kind of rigged for. It's very easy for a Republican or a Democratic candidate to get on a ballot, but very difficult for independents and third parties. But to a large degree, the Libertarian Party has sort of cracked that nut. And so for RFK, the Libertarian Party was something that was of interest to him. But Trump had sort of a different approach. Now, Trump, of course, is looking to pick up fringe candidates, or excuse me, fringe voters on the periphery, because the race is going to be so darn close. Not just the national popular election, but in each of those swing states, you pick up an extra 1 or 2% of the vote. That might be enough to flip a swing state one way or the other. And so Trump was obviously coming to the Libertarian Party to try to get their support and to try to, wrap his arms around the party and bring them into the fold, into the MAGA fold, which is insane. But that's what was going on. And meanwhile, the Libertarian Party leadership was thinking, oh, this will be great for the Libertarian Party. We'll get more attention. There'll be more focus on libertarians. And in fact, we might even be able to get some of these leading candidates like Trump, like RFK, and even maybe Biden, if he accepted the invitation. We might get those leading candidates to make certain concessions to the Libertarian Party, because the Libertarian Party knows they're going to lose. It's a stone cold lock. They're going to lose. But they have been thinking, well, are there other ways they can influence the election process to get some outcomes that are aligned with the party, with the platform preferences of the Libertarian Party? And that was their thinking going in. And in fact, there have been some people in the Libertarian Party that have been talking about this, saying libertarians should completely abandon the idea of trying to win elections because it's impossible. Instead, they should go through the process of putting forward candidates, but at the same time, try to get Republicans and Democrats to come around on bringing in some libertarian leadership or libertarian policies into their platform. For example, lowering taxes, ending the foreign wars, etc. And if they did, then the libertarian candidate might endorse one of the Republican or Democratic candidates. And that was the idea here. But in the end, this turned into a big mess, just a huge mess, because Trump, first of all, trying to make a deal with Trump, trying to get Trump to make certain, how should I say, to extend an arm to libertarians and promise them that he's going to do A, B, or C if the libertarians support him or endorse him, it's like Chamberlain trying to negotiate with Hitler. I mean, you don't negotiate with a con man. I mean, and so a lot of these libertarians are thinking, oh, hey, we got Trump to promise to release political prisoners, Edward Snowden, who called out President Biden for all of his illegal spying. The NSA spying that went beyond Fourth Amendment protection. He also wants, the Libertarians also want to see Julian Assange released because of all the WikiLeaks that he released in 2016. And then there is Ross Ulbricht, who is the guy that built the website, the Silk Road, which enabled a lot of drug dealers and a lot of sort of black market traffic to occur. But this guy just built a website, and yet he's in prison for the rest of his life. And so these are sort of pet causes of certain libertarians, and they wanted to get Trump to agree that he would pardon those people. And Trump agreed to it in his speech. Trump also agreed to put libertarians in his cabinet or in other leadership positions in his administration. And so these libertarian leaders were saying, see, we were able to get concessions. The fact is that they're negotiating with a guy that said Mexico was going to pay for the border wall. They were negotiating with a con artist, and that's just stupid. the idea of the libertarians trying to get influence in the two major parties is not a bad one, because the system is rigged for the Republicans and Democrats. And the idea of being creative and thinking about different ways the party could have greater leverage, that's smart, but not when you're negotiating with Donald Trump. I mean, then that just idiocy. So Trump gets out there and he's trying to pick up a few votes on the margin, but he's competing, or he's asking for people that support freedom to support a guy that wants to build walls, that wants to have trade wars, that wants to block Muslims from entering the nation, that wants to build a wall along the border wall. All things that are diametrically opposed to the idea of liberty. And this was a match that was never going to work, ever. And of course, what happened? The crowd cheered for him, but that was a small portion of the crowd. For the most part, they booed him, they jeered him, and then we got to watch pure comedy when he was up on stage. Trump had his teleprompters up, giving a speech that seemed obvious to me he had never read before. And he was stumbling through the speech, and it was idiotic. And granted, remember, he's using teleprompters when he used to criticize Biden and Obama for using teleprompters. Of course, he uses one himself. And this speech, he stumbled, he bumbled, he had problems pronouncing people's names. It was disjointed. People were booing him. It was completely befuddled. And you could see Trump up on stage dealing with this rowdy crowd, a crowd that he thought he could win over, and yet they're doing everything except throwing tomatoes and fruit up on stage, just tearing this guy down. And you could see Trump's wheels in his mind turning, getting so angry and upset that his staffers would have set him up to come on a stage like this where he would just get torn to shreds. And so watching all of that unfold was hilarious. And then, then Trump tries to freelance off of his teleprompter speech and throw in a few Trumpisms and zingers that he likes to use. And all of it just fell flat. It was just hilarious. And so the whole thing was a disaster. Now, you might be thinking, why in the hell am I bringing this up? Well, like I said, I would love to see alternatives to Biden and Trump. Those two candidates are horrible for this country. I mean, aside from the fact that Trump is of terrible character and the 34 felonies and the future trials and all of the other nonsense that's well documented in the news about Trump's character and personal life, even his policies were just terrible. The lockdowns during COVID were awful. The corporate welfare, a lot of the other, the trade war, the tariffs, the corporate welfare that went back to farmers to make up for the tariffs, everything about the Trump policies were awful too. There might be a few good ones in there, but it's not even worth mentioning because the bad policies were overwhelming. So we're left with a choice of a con artist and a guy that is like completely inept, is not really aware of where he is or what he's doing in a lot of cases, who, gets confused when he's giving speeches and is clearly, and I'm speaking of Biden, is a puppet for those that are really pulling the strings. So we have two nonsense candidates, and the only thing each of these candidates seems to have going for them is that they're not the other guy. The Biden campaign is primarily pushing a message that Trump is bad as opposed to Biden is good. And Trump is doing the opposite. I mean, Trump is trying to sell America that we're a failed nation. I mean, which is just incredibly foolish. I mean, America is the strongest economy, the strongest nation on the planet, and is built on, a strong moral foundation based on our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Never mind the fact that Trump and Biden want to violate those inalienable rights all the time. So I'm watching all this and just blown away by it all, because it's insane that in a nation of, what do we have, 250 million people, these are the two candidates we're left with, Trump and Biden. And meanwhile, there are third parties. The system is rigged against them. Independents and third parties, they have trouble getting on ballots because the ballot access rules are more difficult. They typically need more signatures and more qualification criteria to be met just to get on a ballot than a Republican or Democrat. You hear all this commentary from the left about voter suppression and the Republicans want to take away the right to vote. Well, both parties issue candidate suppression by making it harder for certain candidates to get on the ballot. I mean, it's amazing if you break it down by state. I should do that in a future podcast and show you the data. But the system is rigged against third parties. That's why when we get to, say, well, there's going to be a debate later this month, right, between Biden and Trump. I think I saw it was going to be listed here in late June, and there will hopefully be more debates, but there will only be two people on that stage. Never mind the fact that more people in America are like me, that are registered as independent, that are registered as no party preference. There are more people registered as no party preference than registered as Republican or than registered as Democrat. Think about that. There are more independents than there are Republicans or Democrats. Yet, there's no representative of independents on that stage. And on many ballots, there's no independent representative or third-party representative at all. I mean, that's certainly what we get here in California with their top two plan. So, anyways, keep an eye on this. I think the Libertarian Party and all the other third parties, the Greens, and we had the Reform Party with Ross Perot, they're going to continue to run into roadblocks. I just want to see a reawakening of independent voters and having, let's just say, policy ideas that are more aligned with what mainstream people want, or in fact, more aligned with letting people run their own lives. We don't need Republicans telling women how to micromanage their bodies. We don't need Democrats telling business owners how to micromanage their business. We just need candidates that are going to leave people alone. Don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. And that's kind of where I align on this. So, everything you're going to start hearing this election season, it's about the vote. You got to vote. You got to do this. You got to vote. But I think it's important to understand that rationally, mathematically, you get only one vote, just one. So a lot of times people say you need to pick between Biden and Trump. You need to pick a lesser of two evils. The fact is you don't. You don't. And people will say, well, what if, your vote takes away from Trump or takes away from Biden if you vote for a third party candidate or independent? The risk of the election being flipped like that is at this period in time is almost nil. The state of California is overwhelming a blue state. Overwhelming, not even close. And there is no chance in hell that Republicans are going to win California. So it doesn't matter if you vote for Trump or you vote for Biden or you do a write-in or you vote for a third party or you don't vote at all. Biden's still going to win California. So what I tend to think about with voting, it's not necessarily a strategic mathematical calculation as to which candidates I want to support and which candidates I want to block and that sort of thing, which is typically how a lot of voters vote. What I do is I just see voting as an opportunity for self-expression. I don't have any delusion that my single vote is going to break a tie and that, everybody in the state of California is looking to me to break the tie because the rest of the state is 50-50. Well, that's not true at all. So I tend to look at this. The voting is good. You should vote. It's a great way to have self-expression, but don't get too hung up on if you vote for candidate A, you're really giving your vote to candidate B, and some of these odd mathematical rationalizations that people do. And it's also worth noting that one of the reasons I do this podcast is that I want to have some sort of impact, some sort of influence on what's happening in my local community and, on on a grander scale nationally, I like to have some incremental influence, and I think we can do that in a podcast and to greater degrees as the audience grows. And really, I think if we want to adjust or shift, the way society is run, it comes down not to the ballot box. It has to happen much sooner, much further upstream. People say culture is upstream from politics, and that's true. But in other cases, just philosophy and ideas are even further upstream from culture. And so that's one of the things I try to do in this podcast is just discuss ideas. And that's part of what we're doing here. So this effort by President Trump to try to win the Libertarian Party endorsement ended in a disaster. The party leadership is now two-faced about it because the Libertarian Party did nominate Chase Oliver, who's kind of a left-leaning libertarian, very sympathetic to COVID mask-wearing policies, very sympathetic to LGBTQ, which is fine. I don't object to that. But he leans into that a lot. And as a result, he's alienated certain other members of the party. Now what you're finding is amazing is that the Libertarian Party isn't necessarily promoting their candidate. Instead, what they're saying is, we are going to promote our candidate in blue states to try to help tear down Biden, but not necessarily in red states. So in essence, the Libertarian Party now has become another MAGA party, and they are rootin' and tootin' for Trump. And if that sounds outlandish to you, it's not. There was like 2 or 3 years ago, there was a rally in Washington, D.C. on the mall there, and it was a rally against the Russian-Ukraine war. And libertarians tend to be very, pro-peace, anti-war, non-intrusive foreign policy, really pacifists in a lot of ways. For them, it's just war is bad, end of story, rather than understanding the reasons for the war and the moral implications of the war, because sometimes war is necessary. But in that rally to try to have peace between Russia and Ukraine, the Libertarian Party was actually out there in support of Russian influencers that were aligned with President Putin. And to me, this is like another case of how they are completely missing the boat. So I left the Libertarian Party over a decade ago, and I'm so glad I did. It feels very liberating to be an independent voter and not feel like I have to compromise my values to kind of line in with a party. But that's the case. Okay, we got a comment here on the live stream. This is from Yuri Bowl, and he says, it's all about 3% for government funding. What are you talking about here, Yuri? The Libertarian Party does get about 3% of the vote. They're the largest third party in America. Are the two parties fighting over about 3% of government funding? In a lot of ways, they are. I mean, if you think about it, the Republicans and Democrats want to spend huge money on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Department of Defense, Department of Education, welfare programs, Department of Commerce, yada, yada, yada. We can go down the list. They may differ slightly to a degree on each of those. Some might want a little bit more or a little bit less funding. But in the end, yeah, the two main parties are really just fighting, along the fringes. They create an illusion that it's, the angel versus the devil, that it's good versus evil. But if you really break it down and look at the things that they support, you're going to, and not what they say, but what they do and what they vote on, you're going to find that these two parties are insanely similar in so many different ways. I mean, for example, now President Biden is implementing executive orders on immigration, to make immigration tougher, to essentially appease Republicans and appease certain independent voters that they don't leave and vote for Trump, because he's trying to address the border problem. Of course, the Republicans were hypocritical on that. They refused to pass a bill when they had an opportunity to get mostly everything they wanted. Biden and the Dems refused. And now Biden and the Dems are signing executive orders to give the Republicans exactly what they want. Uri goes on to say, third parties need either 2 or 3% of the popular vote to qualify for government fundings for their respective causes. That's true. And I think those thresholds kind of vary depending on the situation. But in order to get federal matching funds, they've got to meet certain thresholds in voting. And that's a huge part of what the Libertarians are trying to hold on to and maintain. Ironically, of course, Libertarians don't want federal funding of elections in the first place. Taxpayers subsidizing ad campaigns for politicians. But that's a tangent. But yeah, there is government funding that's at stake here. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Libertarians and Trump. I got a couple more things we're going to talk about. We're going to get into some political myths that I've been seeing online that I wanted to break down for you because we're getting into election season. There's just so much rhetoric. It's nuts. And at the same time, I want to tell you a little bit about our vacation to Ireland and just some of the highlights because it was a great trip and I thought I'd share some of that. If you want to learn more about what we're doing with the John Riley Project, you can always go to my website, johnrileyproject.com. You can sign up, get on our mailing list. You can get all of our old episodes. Just check out johnrileyproject.com. You go to connectwithjohnny.com if you just want to find out where I'm active on social media. I'm usually on Twitter a lot. So if you want to follow me there on X, you can get all those links at connectwithjohnny.com. And we're getting into the election season here locally. So I'm hoping to have a lot more local candidates. So I'll put this out there again. If you're a local candidate running for office, there's an open invitation for you to join me here in my podcast studio. And we'll talk about your platform and the things that you want to accomplish and why you're running. And it doesn't matter what you're running for. If you're running for Poway City Council, Escondido City Council, you're running for county supervisor in San Diego, you're running for the president of the United States, you're running for school board in Santee or in Poway, well, come on down and join me. So if you want to find out more, go to johnrileyproject.com, fill out our contact form and get in touch with me. Okay, let's go on. And I want to break down certain political myths that because if you, I'm on Twitter quite a bit and you'll see people ranting, Republican talking points and Democratic talking points. And almost always they're very wrong or very lopsided or very misleading. So here's a great one that you're seeing coming around is that the Republicans, they're insisting that Trump lowered taxes for the middle class. Because what you will hear from Democrats is like, oh no, the Trump tax cuts were for corporations and rich people, not for regular people, the poor, the middle class. Well, while this is what makes a lot of these myths somewhat believable when they're really not. Because while there was some tax relief for the middle class and poor in the Trump tax cuts in the form of tax deductions and even a lowering of the rate at the low end, on a dollar perspective, it didn't make a huge difference, but there is still some. But it's horrible to say this, that Trump lowered taxes for the middle class when Trump is trying to increase taxes on tariffs, increase taxes on imported goods to make imported goods more expensive or to provide protection for American companies to charge higher prices because competitive forces can't compete with them on an even playing field. So people forget that tariffs are taxes. Tariffs are taxes on Americans. They're not taxing the Chinese. They're not taxing South Korea when they put taxes on imports. The entity that pays the tax on the imports is the importer, where they pay the duty at the port when it comes in. And then that cost is kind of built into the expense of that product. And as it goes to distributors and retailers, it's passed on. And those prices are ultimately paid for by the consumer. So, in fact, that's the way all corporate taxes are. And Trump has not only increased tariffs, but he's threatening to increase them dramatically more. And the whole MAGA crowd is excited about this, and they feel like they're sticking it to the man and they're protecting America. But in reality, what they're doing is penalizing hardworking Americans by forcing them to pay higher prices. That's just wrong. Just wrong. Um, and the other angle to this is, well, let me move on. Let's go on to another myth, and we'll share about some other angles. Here's another one, a myth. Biden, you hear this from the Republicans, Biden is to blame for inflation and high prices. It all happened on his watch. That's when inflation went through the roof. Well, again, there is an element of truth here. But the reason we have inflation is because of government policies during COVID. When government printed and distributed $6 trillion in brand spanking new money and essentially carpet bombed America with stimulus checks and PPP loans and huge subsidies to corporations. They did all of this right when the COVID thing broke in the second quarter, mostly in the second quarter of 2020 and on out through 2020 into 2021. But when they did that, when they massively increased the money supply, they diminished the value of the dollar. And that's what caused inflation to go up. And of that $6 trillion, how do you break it down between Trump and Biden? Well, about $4 trillion of it came on Trump's watch, and about $2 trillion of it came on Biden's. Now, inflation wasn't caused just because of the increase in the money supply and the distribution of all this free money. It was a radical increase in the money supply. But the second part of it is that a lot of small businesses were forcibly shut down. So as a result, you have less supply being created because companies are shut down. Now, some of them shut down on their own because of COVID, but a lot of companies here in California, if you were deemed non-essential, Gavin Newsom shut you down or tied one hand behind your back or limited the number of people you could have in your facility, all these strict rules. And in many cases, shutting businesses down and penalizing businesses for reopening without government approval, without government permission. And so when you have a restriction in production, supply goes down of goods and services. And when you are carpet bombing $6 trillion, throwing money out of helicopters to people, into corporations in subsidies in the form of PPP loans that were waived, in the form of stimulus checks that went out all across the economy, now you're increasing demand while supply is low. And what happens when demand goes up and supply goes down? You get higher prices, you get inflation. So you see Republicans touting this myth that Biden is to blame for inflation and high prices, when in fact, it's mostly Trump. Yeah, sure, Biden is part of it. And granted, inflation has come down during the Biden administration, but that's mostly because businesses started opening up. The marketplace was deregulated and businesses were allowed to open and production went up and supply was increased. That was helpful. And a lot of the impact from all the flood of money is starting to lessen now that they've turned the spigot off of it. But prices are still insane high. I mean, if you don't believe it, go to a grocery store. They're still high. Look at the price of housing, whether it's for real estate purchases or rentals. Prices are insane. The price of cars is really expensive. And sure, Target and a couple of other retailers are starting to ratchet down their prices a little, but that was after years of radically increasing prices. So if you want to blame inflation on anyone, it starts with Trump, and then Biden is in the number 2 slot. Neither one of them is blameless, and that's just a fact. So that's just another myth that you see out there. Here's JT saying Trump 2024. See, these Trump people, they just love their guy. I mean, he's like a cult figure for them. And it just seems that they're just disconnected from a lot of the policies that he brings forward. Let's talk about another myth. This is a good one. Okay. And this is the myth is tax cuts are driving the nation into debt. Now, this was a recent tweet by Heather Cox Richardson, who you might know of her. She's a journalist and very outspoken, kind of a center left journalist that a lot of people in the Democratic Party really support a lot of her messaging in social media. But this is just flat out false. Tax cuts are not the primary reason that our nation is $34 trillion in debt. Consider the Trump tax cuts in 2017, I think is when they occurred. Roughly speaking, that was a $2 trillion tax cut over 10 years. So the impact on revenue, roughly speaking, is about $200 billion a year in so-called lost revenue, if you want to frame it that way. And in fact, the George W. Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s was about the same impact. It impacted revenue around $200 billion a year. So even if you added together the tax cuts of Trump and Bush, roughly speaking, and let's say you remove the tax cuts, maybe revenue would go up about $400 billion a year. Maybe. That's assuming everything else stays the same, that there are no secondary effects of those tax increases. But the deficit right now is almost $2 trillion. In fact, last I checked, it was $1.7 trillion. The deficit through the COVID years was like stupid high. It was like $4 or $5 trillion. The deficit hasn't been below $500 billion a year for God knows how long. I don't think it was ever that low, even during Obama. The fact is that it's overspending that is creating all this debt, because no matter how much they promised tax cuts. Look at George W. Bush, massive expansion of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, massive expansion of the Department of Education under Republican George W. Bush. He almost doubled funding for the Department of Education. Huge expansion of the police state, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, beefing up the FBI, the CIA, and all of that. And Bush increased spending on Medicare for prescription drugs. And all of those spending increases, plus countless others, are massively more than the tax cuts that he offered in 2001 and in 2003. Same thing is true with Trump. When Trump was president, even before COVID, he just wanted to keep spending money. He wanted to increase pay for the troops, and you may support that, and there's a lot of reasons to support that, but he wanted to spend more money on military, more money on Social Security, more money on Medicare, and then a shit ton of money on corporate welfare, because Trump wanted to try to win over people by giving them free stuff, by giving them more. And to hell, to the debt, the deficit, be damned with that. He didn't care. And even during the Trump years, even after the tax cut in 2017, revenue went up, federal revenue went up every year. Every year. But spending went up way more. The same thing is true of President Bush. In the 2003 tax cuts, revenue went up for the federal government for 4 straight years after that. And then it finally took a dive in 2008. Well, what happened in 2008? Of course, there was the Great Recession, but that certainly wasn't caused by tax cuts. So a lot of people will throw around these tax cut accusations, trying to point the finger that it's the problem is the rich, the problem is the corporations, yada, yada. But in reality, neither one of these parties, Republican or Democrat, care about the debt. The Republicans are often blamed during the Trump years that he increased the national debt by $7 trillion in his 1 4-year term, which is true. But Biden has done approximately the same in his 4-year term. And in fact, if you look at the national debt and how much has been created historically by both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations, it's roughly 50-50. Roughly speaking, about half of it was created under Republican presidents, and roughly half of it was created by Democratic presidents. President Obama all by himself was almost a $10 trillion increase in the national debt in his 8 years. So people saying tax cuts are driving the nation into debt, that's propaganda. That's divisive. It's trying to pit, one group against another, and it's disconnected from reality. But you're going to see a lot of this in the current election cycle. And here's the fourth myth I'd like to blow out of the water. And I saw this from the Biden campaign today. Billionaires need to pay their fair share. And, we've been hearing this forever, from Elizabeth Warren to Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, essentially saying that the rich people are not paying enough. Well, first of all, do they ever define what a fair share is? They never do. It's an intentionally undefined term, fair share. It means whatever you want it to mean. So first of all, what's fair? And when it comes to taxation, what's fair? I think you'll get different opinions from different people on the issue. Some people think it's fair to tax the rich at a higher rate and to tax the poor nothing at all. Other people think it's fair that we have the same tax rate for everybody, essentially a flat tax, so that everyone is taxed at the same level, proportionally. Some people think that taxation itself is unjust, and there's no way the word fair can be used in a discussion about taxation, which is generally where I line up. So, and then on top of it, what's their share? How do you compute what your share is? Are you talking about your share of federal government spending? Are you talking about, well, what are you talking about? I mean, after all, what is your fair share of spending money, of the money that was spent, let's just say, on the Afghanistan war that lasted for 20 years? What's your share of that? What is your duty, your responsibility? How do you decide that? It's just a nebulous term. It means nothing. And yet it is used as a political weapon. And you'll see this every election cycle. And they'll also claim, oh, the rich, they don't pay taxes at all. And that's a bunch of crap as well. I mean, just, was it a year ago? Elon Musk paid, if I got it right, $11 billion in taxes when he was moving money around to take cash out of his equity in Tesla so that he could buy Twitter. It's the biggest, payment in taxes by a single person of anyone in American history. The rich pay a ton. In fact, how does this go? It's 70% of all taxes, federal income taxes, 70% are paid by the top 10%. The bottom 40 to 45% pay no federal taxes at all. And even the top 1% actually pay about 40% of the total federal income tax load. So when you see this, billionaires need to pay their fair share, the first thing you should be asking is, well, what's their fair share? Define it. Do you have a mathematical equation? Do you have a moral argument of what's fair? And have you calculated what their share is? Every time I ask this question of somebody, what is the fair share? Please define fair share. You never get a straight answer. You'll always get an answer that says, oh, they just need to pay more. Or it's not right that a teacher is paying a higher percentage than a billionaire. Well, a flat tax would solve that problem, but they don't want a flat tax. What they want is more and more spending for themselves, and they want other people to pay higher taxes. And that's definitely true of the Republicans as well. That's why they want to burden the middle class and the poor with increases in the price of goods through tariffs, so they can cycle some of that money back in the form of corporate welfare to other people. It's just, the whole thing is, I use a Biden term, a bunch of malarkey. And there are a million other political myths like this that I should break down sometime for you. Because the myth of how people perceive the Republicans and Democrats and the reality of Republicans and Democrats are so diametrically opposed. The myth is that they're good and evil, that they're They're arch enemies that they have. One is for the rich and one is for the little guy, when in fact, 90% of the time, their policies are right in the same ballpark. I mean, look at all the COVID policies, all the COVID spending that increased all the inflation. It happened on Trump's watch, but who was Speaker of the House? Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat. You might think of Reagan's tax cuts in the 80s. You didn't like those. Who was the Speaker of the House in the 80s? Tip O'Neill, a Democrat. So you can see how this all breaks out. Yuri Bolin on the live stream says, it was Steve Forbes' idea with the flat tax. Now, I think, how do I say this? The whole concept of an income tax, in my opinion, is unjust. You're taking money away from people. You're taking away the fruits of their labor. That's wrong. In my opinion, people should pay for what they use. That's the right way these sorts of government policies should be funded. And then we can break down what all that means. But when you're telling a single mom trying to raise her 2 children in Seattle to pay for a war in Afghanistan for 20 years, that's not just, that's not fair, that's not a share, that's just immoral. So in a lot of ways, I think the taxation in general is immoral. But if you are going to have a tax, a flat tax is the right way to do it. And a flat tax, even Steve Forbes' flat tax wasn't really a flat tax, because what they will do is, the common objection to a flat tax is that the people will say, well, what about the poor? You want to charge the poor 10% or 15%, the same as what the rich have to pay? And they say, well, the poor don't have the money. But 10% of very little is still very little. But usually so-called flat tax proposals make the first $30,000, $40,000 of income tax-free. So it's still a progressive tax code, but it's just a 2-step process. But they also want to include a lot of deductions. And if you have a lot of deductions and withholdings and tax shelters, that's not a flat tax either. A true flat tax would eliminate your deduction for homeowners insurance interest, for your homeowner mortgage interest. Excuse me. You're in a flat tax, the IRS tax law would be reduced to a single page of paper. No exceptions, no special breaks, no carve outs, no tax loopholes for anybody. And everyone would pay the same rate. Now, that's not exactly what Steve Forbes presented, Yuri, but it's close. I mean, I think he wanted to keep some of the deductions, particularly the home interest one, because that's obviously one of the biggest deductions that most middle-class people take. But in my opinion, if you have to tax at the federal level, a flat tax on income is probably the least worst of all the possible ways to do it, as long as it's truly flat and that percentage is as low as it possibly can be. But what do we have now? We got different tax rates for different people and different deductions for different special interests and different withholdings and tax carve-outs for special interests. The tax code is a mess. The tax code is about picking winners and losers, and it's anything but fair or anything but share or anything but just. It's a distortion, a manipulation of the way the economy works. And who's behind it? You know who? Both the Republicans and Democrats, because they're getting donations from a lot of the lobbyists. And what do the lobbyists want? They want carve-outs for their industry. They want special protection for their special interests. And that all gets baked into the regulatory code or into the tax code, et cetera. And that's why we are where we are. So I will break down more of these political myths in future stories, particularly in these John Riley Project episodes when there's not a lot of local stuff to talk about. Okay. So that is political myths. But if you have some more thoughts or comments, be sure to type it in the live stream or the live chat on Facebook, X, or on YouTube. We'll get you involved. Yuri jumped in, had a few comments. If you got a thought or a comment, please do. One other thing I want to promote before I talk a little bit about our Ireland trip Um, I do another podcast. I started the John Riley Project podcast in 2018, and it's been a great thrill and exciting. But now I'm doing a second podcast on sports with Lee Hacksaw Hamilton, and boy, is that just terrific! A lot of fun, and the numbers there are just blowing up. I mean, Hacksaw, we post videos on Instagram that are getting over 100,000 views. I mean, just really amazing some of the things that we're pulling off there. And I'm trying to take a lot of my learning lessons from Lee Hacksaw Hamilton podcast, which we've had great success in a lot of dimensions, and trying to bring that here to the John Riley Project. So if you want to check out Lee Hacksaw Hamilton, it's every Monday and Thursday. We live stream at 1:00 Pacific time on Facebook, X, or YouTube. Just look up Lee Hacksaw Hamilton. Of course, you might be wondering, who in the hell is Lee Hacksaw Hamilton? Well, he is one of the pioneers in sports talk radio. He helped start up XTRA 690 in an all sports format here in San Diego in the late 1980s. And he was the longtime play-by-play man for the San Diego Chargers and the Seattle Seahawks, as well as the USC Trojans, Arizona State Sun Devils, and the Columbus team in the WHL, besides the Phoenix Giants and a lot of other minor league teams. Guy brings so much to the table, and it's fantastic. So if you love sports, look for Lee Hacksaw Hamilton wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. And you'll see me pop up a little bit there. I'm kind of his wingman. But I try to carry over some of the lessons from that podcast into mine. But my John Riley Project podcast, I tend to be really, really niche, or really focused on local commentary. And I think that's good and important, but it's a very limited audience. So maybe it's good that I'm talking about Trump and the national election and Biden and stuff today, because maybe that'll help grow the audience. So tell me what you think. Should I just stay exclusively focused on local content, or do you like it when I go outside of those boundaries? Okay, let's get to our third topic, and then we'll wrap up this bad boy. Again, feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts or comments. I want to talk a little bit about our trip to Ireland. And my wife and I, we went on a 3-week vacation in May. And 2.5 of those 3 weeks, we were in Ireland, and it was just fantastic. And, I'm not going to turn this into a, how should I say, one of those old school, sit in someone's living room, watch a slideshow presentation of their trip to the Grand Canyon. It's not going to be one of those, but I just want to give you just some highlights. If you've never been to Ireland, you've always kind of wondered about it. For me, this was a magical opportunity because, I've talked a lot about my ancestry, and that's a big kind of a personal project I'm working on with ancestry.com and trying to build this puzzle of my upline and my family tree. And, my roots go back to Ireland. In fact, on the DNA test in ancestry.com, which is when you usually find out, oh, I'm a 12% Czech, or I've got a little bit of African in me, or maybe a little Asian. When I did my DNA test in ancestry.com, I came back 100% Irish, not a speck of anything else, which is incredible. So all of my roots go back to Ireland. I've heard all the family stories because my great grandparents were born in Ireland. And then some of my grandparents had visited Ireland. And then, of course, some of my more modern day relatives have as well. But I had never made the trek. And the fine wife and I, we were looking to go somewhere. She had a vacation time. And so this is where we went. And we just had a splendid time. We went to Dublin. We were in Kinsale. We were in the Barra Peninsula, went to the Cliffs of Moher, a lot of different things. But here's just a couple of bullet points, to kind of wet your tongue, to give you a taste of it. First, we're going into Dublin is where we landed. Dublin is like any other big European city, but it's sort of like a second tier. It's not like Vienna or Munich. It's smaller. It's not like Rome. It's smaller, but it has a lot of that same characteristics of a lot of history, a lot of old buildings, a lot of churches, an old industrial area, and just a lot of culture. And the people were just so friendly. It was funny. We were at one pub, and I was talking to some of these young kids, and they said, "Oh, you're from America," and they were asking me questions, and they're saying, "How do you like Dublin?" And I said, "I liked it." And they said, "Wow, it's just too expensive here." And it is expensive. There's no doubt about that. But we went to the Guinness brewery in Dublin, and that was a lot of fun. I had previously gone to the brewery in the Anheuser-Busch brewery in St. Louis about a year ago. So it was cool to go to the Guinness brewery in Dublin. That's sort of a big tourist spot. We went to St. Patrick Cathedral. Just did a lot of walking around town. I mean, we piled up like 10,000 steps a day for most of our vacation, and some days we went over 20,000 steps, which I was really proud of. Then we rented a car from Dublin. And, when you rent a car in Dublin, everything's on the other side of the road. We're driving on the left side of the road. The steering wheel is on the right side of the car. And I was going to get a manual transmission because it was cheaper and I wanted the adventure and the challenge of it all. But my wife talked me out of it, which is probably a good thing. So we got an automatic transmission. And I drove on the opposite side of the road before when we were in the UK. It takes a little getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, you do a lot better. But it's still an adventure driving on these roads. And the roads, by the way, in Ireland, once you get outside of Dublin, like in Dublin, there are like legitimate freeways with exits, kind of like what we have in America. But once you get beyond that, there are no freeways. The so-called highways, you might have, if you're lucky, 2 lanes in each direction. But for the most part, it's a lot of single lane in each direction, a 2-lane road. And the further south you go, the more narrow the roads get, to the point where you're on a 2-lane road that's really only a lane and a half wide, that you can't pass cars going in the opposite direction. One car has to pull over to the side to let the other one go by. And that's a normal thing on a lot of these roads. So it just took a lot of patience and a lot of, careful driving to kind of pull all that off. But we ended up going into Kinsale, which is on the eastern coast, very southeastern. It's actually even south of the city of Cork. It's in County Cork. And this is where my mother's side of the family is mostly from. A lot of them were in Kinsale. And it was neat to finally see it in person, because it was like one of those small fishing villages that had been transformed, apparently in the last 20 to 30 years, had been transformed into this beautiful, quaint village that has a lot of tourist attractions. There's like tours that go through it, but still just very, very quiet, very comfortable, very relaxing, very slow paced. Lots of nice little restaurants and pubs. There's fishing boats in the harbor. You'll see even little dinghies kind of, tethered up to a pier. Just a real cool vibe. And while we were there, we went on the Scilly Walk. And I know it sounds kind of funny, Scilly, spelled Scilly. And that's sort of the rural area just outside of Kinsale, where I had actually an address of one of my family members who had registered there in the 1903 Irish census. And I was hoping to go find that house and be able to take a picture with it, but we couldn't find it anywhere. We eventually stumbled into to Bowman's Pub, and my wife and I were talking. And meanwhile, there was a guy at a table next to us that overheard us, who was a local historian, local architect, did lectures in the community. And he had a lot of answers for me. And he said a lot of the street names and house numbers had changed after Ireland had the revolution and became an independent nation. When is that? I think that was like in the 19-teens. And besides, a lot of those houses from 110, 115 years ago had largely been bulldozed and rebuilt. And it was pretty obvious as we were walking through there. But it was just a really neat kind of a stroll through nature, it's like a time warp to a different era. We worked our way over to Fort Charles. And you learn a little bit more about the history, because the Irish are always fighting the English, and they were either partnering with the Spanish or they were partnering with the French to fight against the English. And the Irish would obviously always lose these fights. But Fort Charles was a big military fort there that was done in partnership with the Spanish. And it was this big fortress that was over the inbound into the port. And, it was during times of warfare in the 1700s and 1800s. It's very interesting. And all the ruins were there. And then we meandered about there. And then we wanted to go to the Beara Peninsula. And if you've ever looked at a map of Ireland, on the very, very southern part, there are like these fingers that jettison out, sort of pointing south, southwest. And there are three primary peninsulas. And the middle one is called the Beara Peninsula. And that is where my part of my father's side of the family is from. And that was very interesting as well. But I will just a quick note on our drive from Kinsale to the Beara Peninsula, we went through a lot of small towns where I had ancestry, where some of my great 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 grandparents were either born or died or lived, but I didn't have any tangible evidence of it other than some of the records that I was able to discover while I'm in America doing my ancestry research. I found some of the parishes where certain family members were baptized or were married. But for the most part, I couldn't necessarily find the buildings where they lived because it was so long ago. But we went through the towns of Clonkakilty, Kilbrittain, Court McSherry, where I had relatives that lived there all long ago. But then we worked our way down to Mizenhead. And Mizenhead is the most southern tip of those peninsulas in the southern part of Ireland. And oh my God, was this place spectacular. It was on these cliffs. It's like the cliffs of Dover in many ways. And they had built a lighthouse out there back in the day, because of all the fog and the boats coming by. In fact, the Lusitania, sunk out there in the Irish Sea about 100 years ago. But they had these cliffs, and the cliffs had the green grass like the cliffs of Moher, the ocean just a brilliant blue, the big blue sky. We were there on a sunny day, and these bridges that would take you from one part of these cliffs to another part. It was kind of like in Game of Thrones when they went to the Iron Islands. You remember who was the guy that was semi-adopted by the Starks, and his family was from the Iron Islands. And you remember they had those pillars with these bridges that were connecting various pillars over the water. They were man-made, essentially narrow plateaus, like from a Roadrunner cartoon. And these were all over the Mizenhead area. And it was just unbelievable. I mean, the picture taking we did there was incredible. Then we worked our way towards the Beara Peninsula. We stayed in a town called Glengariff. And in that area, really cool. We went to a place called Garnish Island, which has all of these trees and plants that are brought in from all places around the world, and had some sort of like Roman, Greek or Roman types of structures, and also some castle-like structures on this really small island. But it was really more of a delight for people that were arborists, that people that wanted to explore nature and look at different kinds of plants. But it was very, very well done, and just a beautiful trip. We took a little ferry over to the island, had a great time. We went down to Castletown, and then we went to a town called Eyeries, which is on the, how should I say, the western coast of the Beara Peninsula. And that's also another town where I had relatives. And my uncle on my father's side had been to Eyeries about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And he took some pictures there. And my wife and I were able to get pictures in the exact same spots. It was pretty cool. And then we went into a postal / grocery store in this small little village. And I was talking to the lady about some of these sites in Eyeries and how to find them, because we wanted to have our photo taken there. Well, then she ended up having a 45-minute conversation with us about genealogy. And it turned out that she was related to me. I mean, it's a very distant relation, but she has a surname that matches up with the surnames of some of my great-grandparents. So it just, all these connections was just really cool. And to be in this area, which, by the way, on the Beara Peninsula, there is copper mining there. And that's why a lot of the copper miners in Ireland went to Butte, Montana, where my family went. And they mined copper in Butte before eventually working their way to San Francisco. So to see all those connections was really special. And, the whole time I'm thinking, okay, we're only here for a week and a half. And I'm with my wife, who probably doesn't share the same enthusiasm I have for my ancestry research. So we were able to do sort of like how should I say, a quick flyover, in each of these communities to sort of get a lay of the land, go out, walk around, visit some restaurants and pubs. Every village had one church and at least 2 or 3 pubs in Ireland. It was amazing. But I do want to go back because I could see myself wanting to really go deep and going through a lot of public records, parish records on baptisms and things. And if I did that, I could be gone for a month and my wife would go crazy. So that might be another trip in our future. But then we worked our way up towards the Cliffs of Moher from the Beara Peninsula. And that's like a 3-hour drive. It took us a while to get there. We went through Killarney Park and we saw the Torque Waterfalls, a Lady in Waiting viewpoint, which was wonderful, just a gorgeous national park. And while we were passing through towards the Cliffs of Moher, we were on one of the brief moments where there was a freeway and there was a town with an exit called Shannon Town. And so if you know me, my daughter's name is Shannon. And so this is great, so we wanted to get a picture in front of a Shannon Town sign. And we couldn't find a really good one, at least as we were driving around. But then we went online and we found this great sort of monument sign that said Shannontown in English and in Gaelic. And we thought, oh, this is perfect. We'll go find that sign and get our photo, my wife and I, taken in front of the sign. We could share it with our daughter, be kind of a fun little photo. We couldn't find this monument sign anywhere. And so finally we were in a grocery store because I think we had to run in there to use their restroom. And we came out and there was a family loading their groceries into the back of their wagon, their little hatchback wagon. And I just said quickly, excuse me, we're from out of town. And I showed them on my phone, do you know where this sign is? And I showed them a picture of the monument sign. It turned into like a half an hour, if not an hour of their time enthusiastically and voluntarily helping us try to find this sign because they thought they had seen it. They knew it was somewhere around. They started walking around this area. They drove around and they eventually found it for us. And they couldn't have been nicer. And boy, were they friendly. And we ended up getting the photo taken, which was terrific. But it was just a trivial thing that was just kind of good for our family. Then we get down to the Cliffs of Moher and spectacular. I mean, those, again, the green grass on the top of the cliffs with sheer cliffs going down, beautiful grass, or beautiful blue sea, right there. That's the Atlantic Ocean. But it was crowded. And, there's a big tourist kind of visitor center there. A lot of, small businesses that are selling tourist products and souvenirs. But still, there was a lot of room there to wander and walk around. Cliffs of Moher is one of those things I think you sort of check a box. It's like if you're in Ireland, you need to go. And we enjoyed it and we're glad we went. But for me, the time in Kinsale and the time in the Beara Peninsula were just wonderful. And we just had a really great time. But, I remember telling my wife while we were walking around in parts of the Beara Peninsula and parts of Kinsale, a lot of the view, a lot of the vision, the pictures I was seeing in front of me as we were walking around was like a jigsaw puzzle I put together as a child, where there might be a rowboat tethered up to a fishing pier with maybe some trees in the background, and a little bit of water features and just a very calming sort of rural country space. It was everywhere. And as we drove around Ireland, there was cattle, there was sheep, farmers, just spectacular views everywhere we went. And we just had a great time. And we were there for a week and a half, not a year and a half, a week and a half. And we wanted to squeeze in another place before we went home. And we ended up going to Lisbon, Portugal. And I'll save that story for another podcast. But that was also really, really good, but for very, very different reasons. And we'll break that down at a future time. So, okay. So that is the John Riley Project for this week. So what do you think? We didn't have a whole lot of sort of local news in the San Diego community. I saw the city of San Diego just passed a new budget. There might be some things to comment there. There's always something going on in Poway. I think we're going to find more updates on this Lifetime Fitness deal as it goes in front of the city council. Already a lot of people are up in arms about some exceptions to the rules, some changes in the way they're calculating traffic, and a lot of people micromanaging the way the farm in Poway is being set up. But I think we're going to start to see some development there, because right now they're sort of in limbo. Other stories in Poway that we will follow up on in future podcasts is the Amazon Fresh store, which we did a whole podcast episode on over a year ago. And the Amazon Fresh store now, they're finally going in and doing more renovations. And everyone's wondering what's going to happen there. And then, of course, election season is just around the corner. Filing for local elections for Poway City Council, Poway School Board, and all the other local elections in San Diego County, those candidates have to start filing in July, and I think up through like early August, if I recall. And we're going to start to see candidates getting out there. And, of course, we'll be talking about them on the podcast. We'll be inviting them here. And there is a standing invitation for any political candidate to join me. And, it's funny. When I'm on social media, talking with a lot of locals about some of these things, it's interesting because I enjoy the discussion. I enjoy the conversation. I enjoy hearing other people's views on issues. And I may not necessarily agree with them, but I can hopefully understand them and understand their moral framework or their logic that leads them to the things they believe in and why they believe in them. What's interesting, I'm finding here in talking on social media, a lot of times the people that run some of the social media pages, they don't want to hear diverse commentary. They don't want to be inclusive. They just want to have their point of view mentioned. But in my podcast, if you really looked at it critically and you look at all the different guests that I've had, especially the political candidates, I would hope that you would take this away from it. Number one is I let them talk. I let them say everything they want to say about their positions, their platform, etc. I don't gotcha them. I don't trick them. I don't try to get them in a bad, awkward moment. I don't try to zing them. I just let them talk, and I'll ask questions because I want to learn and I want my audience to learn, but I don't shut them down. And in fact, if you know my point of view, and I expressed quite a bit of it in the first topic here, talking about libertarians and Trump, talking about political myths, you'll learn that a lot of times, probably over 80% of the time, I don't agree with my guests. In fact, I may strongly disagree, but I don't attack them for it. I will ask them questions and how should I say, politely debate. Debate with integrity, but more trying to get them to express their point of view. And then a lot of times the way that I question those candidates is trying to be sort of the voice of the people in terms of the objections or the comments that I'm hearing from others about these candidates and their platforms. I try to channel that as well as my own particular point of view and preferences. And I'm looking forward to doing more of that. I would like to see more of that, not only in podcasting, but on social media. But sadly, there are some people here that want to ban people from certain social media groups, and we know who you are. And right now I'm banned from one of them, but I'm supposed to be reinstated later today. But I don't know. Who knows how long I'll last there. Okay, so this is the John Riley Project. It is 2:30 on Wednesday, June 12th. And wishing you, a great day. Hey, you know what? Juneteenth is around the corner, right? Is that Monday? It might be. I did a podcast on Juneteenth a number of years ago. Juneteenth should be National Independence Day #2. That's how highly I think of Juneteenth. So looking forward to, talking more about that in a future podcast. Okay, friends, hope you had a great time. And I am signing off. This is John Riley for Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Have a great day. We'll see you later.